Hey, what's up guys? Joker here. Today is finally RTX launch day. Well, actually, tomorrow is technically launch day, but I heard the 2080 Ti's are actually being delayed with their shipping. But anyway, today is the day we can actually, I guess you can call it embargo day. Today we can tell you about these cards. We can tell you about all the performance numbers that you've been waiting to see, and we've got a lot of testing to get through here in this video, a lot of content. We've got to cover things like DLSS, ray tracing, 4K, 1080p, 1440, test systems, everything, noise levels, temps. There's so much information. I don't even know what to do with all of it, honestly. So we're going to try to go through everything one at a time. And we'll start off by talking about DLSS and ray tracing, which are the two newest technologies that NVIDIA is pushing. We'll start off with DLSS, which is their new form of anti-aliasing, which is AI assisted, and it's pretty incredible stuff, honestly. But just like ray tracing, we really don't have a whole lot to go on at this time, even though the RTX cards are now here and they're supposed to be bringing in these new technologies. There just aren't any games that are actually using DLSS or ray tracing. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was supposed to have ray tracing when the game came out, but that is not the case, and we're still waiting for that to get patched in. So we only got a small handful of demos from NVIDIA themselves when we got the drivers on Friday. So for DLSS, we got a Final Fantasy 15 benchmark, which was running at 4K with DLSS, and then there's also a bat file for running it with temporal anti-aliasing, and we can't get in there and tweak any of the settings on that or the Star Wars Reflections demo for ray tracing testing. All we can really do is launch these benchmarks and then just watch them play out and get the numbers at the end of the day. So when it came to DLSS, that's their new form of anti-aliasing, which is meant to give seriously improved performance, and it definitely does. You'll be seeing in the side-by-side comparison here on Final Fantasy 15 with the RTX 2080 Ti. Both of these are running at 4K, which was the only resolution available in the benchmark files that we got from NVIDIA for this particular demo. So they're both running at 4K, but the DLSS side is certainly running a hell of a lot better. And visually, honestly, they kind of look exactly the same. I couldn't really spot any major differences visually between one or the other, which I guess really is, the best solution at the end of the day. Is what they want is this to look just like a good form of anti-aliasing, but without having the performance impact. So I guess really we'll just have to wait and see on this. Unfortunately, even though the RTX cards are here, we just don't have a whole lot to go on other than the Final Fantasy 15 demo. And in the test that I ran here with DLSS versus temporal anti-aliasing, the 2080 Ti ended up getting an average of 55 frames per second with DLSS, while with the temporal anti-aliasing, it got an average of 40 FPS, so a 15 FPS bump just by using the new and improved form of anti-aliasing from NVIDIA. So that is definitely some impressive stuff and something I certainly want to see in more games going ahead in the future, but this is going to be requiring developer implementation. This isn't just some blanket thing that we can go ahead and throw onto any game that's ever existed. It's going to have to be supported by the games when they're released, and there are a good amount of titles that are going to be coming in the future that will have it, but right now, we just don't have a whole lot to go on. And when it comes to ray tracing, once again, we just don't have a whole lot to go on here. There was only one demo given to us that can actually take advantage of ray tracing, which is the Star Wars demo that they had showed off earlier this year when ray tracing was first revealed. And until we get it in Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Battlefield 5 and other games in the future, we just won't have a whole lot of benchmarks really to go on with this, but it is definitely very, very taxing, and you will want to be using an RTX card if it's something that you do want to take advantage of. And honestly, I would really only consider the RTX 2080 Ti here for running ray tracing because it is seriously intensive, and even the 2080 struggles to keep up with it. I did run the Star Wars ray tracing demo, and on the 2080 Ti at 4K, it got an average of 34 frames per second, while at 1440p, it got an average of 59 frames per second. Just like with Final Fantasy 15, we were really limited in the way that we were able to test it, so it only had two resolutions available, both in .bat files, so that's really the only way that we can go ahead and run it. But even at 1440p, it's getting an average of 59 FPS, which is pretty impressive because when you're watching it, it looks like pretty much like a top-grade CGI scene, except it's all being rendered in real time, so they definitely have to be commended for that. But, the rumors that we've heard so far about Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Metro Exodus, Battlefield 5 is that it's basically just doing it at 1080p and getting 60 frames per second. If that, I heard Metro Exodus was even running down into the 40s at 1080p. So just like with DLS, unfortunately, we're going to have to wait a little bit longer. The RTX 2080 at 4K got an average of just 26 frames per second, while at 1440p it got an average of 46 frames per second. And I also did try running it on my 1080 Ti, and even at on the 1440p setting, it was getting like 7 frames per second. It was just absolutely soul-crushing to just see the 1080 Ti getting annihilated like that. But that's really the reason they're pushing for RTX and having the RT cores inside of these GPUs, is because that if you want to take advantage of the ray tracing, then you're pretty much going to need one of these new cards unless you just want to take screenshots. But yeah, and then you're looking at a $1,200 entry fee to really take advantage of it and getting a smooth frame rate. But that's something we'll have to test again in the future. Once more games come out with it, I'll definitely be benchmarking those games as they do become available. But for right now, based on what we've seen, it looks like it's a very high price of admission to be getting into just the entry level of using ray tracing. So I'm not really entirely sure if that's going to be worth it for people at the end of the day, but for basic rasterization performance, it might be, depending on what you're wanting to do, and we're going to get into all that very soon. Next up, we have to talk about the NVIDIA Scanner, which is NVIDIA's new auto overclocking utility that works with NVIDIA Boost 4.0. Right now, it is only available in EVGA's Precision X software, but I am told, they've told everyone basically that it will come afterwards for other programs out there. We don't have a full list of it yet, but I'm assuming things like MSI Afterburner, hopefully pretty much all of those major programs from third-party add-in board partners will have this NVIDIA scanner built into them. But right now for the testing, it was only available on EVGA Precision X. And basically the way that it works is you have your graphics card in there, you go ahead and hit the scan button, and it runs a series of tests over about 20, it takes about 20 minutes roughly to actually run through everything. And then when you are done with it, you basically get an auto OC, and you can go ahead and just hit apply, and then it will go ahead and put it onto the card without any other effort from you. Unfortunately, it doesn't overclock the memory, so if you did want to do memory overclocking, that's still something you would have to go ahead and tweak yourself. I was able to get an additional 500 megahertz on my cards running stable, so that wasn't an issue, but the manual OC itself, or I should say the auto OC itself, took both of the cards up over 2 gigahertz, and the OC that they put onto the core, I was not able to beat with my own manual overclock. So it was really like around 2000 to 2050 megahertz, which is definitely a nice bump in performance when you consider you're basically just having to hit a button and then it'll go. And for the person that maybe isn't as informed and doesn't know how to overclock, or is just, scared to ruin their card by overclocking it, then this is definitely could be the way to go if you want to get a little bit of extra performance out of one of your RTX cards. Okay, but that's all of the new features out of the way, so we're going to be getting into the benchmarks right now, but first I want to let you guys know the test system that I was using so you have all of the pertinent information that you need going into these numbers. I was running on my FrameRater build that's running an i7 7700K overclocked to 4.9 gigahertz. It's also got 16 gigabytes of RAM up at 3000 megahertz, and I was using the press driver for every card that I tested. So it was the same driver throughout all of the benchmarks, and that is 411.51. And I did test all the cards with the power limit increased as far to the right as it would go in Precision X, and all of the games tested were at ultra settings with HDR when it was available. And basically my takeaway from testing with the RTX 2080 Ti and the RTX 2080 is that 4K is now a reality, at least when it comes to the RTX 2080 Ti. It can absolutely crush games at 4K ultra settings. Every single game that I ended up testing averaged over 60 frames per second on the 2080 Ti at 4K Ultra, which is pretty damn impressive. But again, it's a $1,200 card, and most of the other cards here that I tested couldn't even really come close to doing that. Most of them were about 10 to 15 frames behind the RTX 2080 Ti, even the RTX 2080, which at this point is kind of just looking like a glorified GTX 1080 Ti. But even in some of the most demanding titles, 4K was running like a dream, pretty much staying over 60 FPS all the time with only a few dips really coming down below 60 frames per second. So if you have been waiting to get a card to be able to play games at 4K Ultra, getting 60 FPS with no compromises, then the 2080 Ti is certainly going to fit that niche. But for $1,200, you're really going to want to be playing at 4K to fully take advantage of it, or 3440 by 1440 ultra wide, which I didn't benchmark here in this video because there was already so much data to go over, but I will definitely be doing that in a follow-up video. So I have not forgotten about you ultra wide users. You will be getting a dedicated video this week, guaranteed. And I say you want to be playing at 4K or 3440 ultra wide because I was seeing CPU bottlenecks even at 1080p on ultra settings, and in some cases even 1440p ultra settings. I was starting to see a CPU bottleneck introduced depending on the game. There were some like super demanding titles like Shadow of the Tomb Raider where I never saw a CPU bottleneck. But on some other games, definitely, 1080p, I think we finally found a card that is literally overkill for 1080p. If you pick up a 2080 Ti to play games at 1080p, then you are going to be seriously hurting yourself at the end of the day, because even with a processor running at almost 5 gigahertz, I was getting limited on how many frames the GPU could actually push out. And we'll go ahead and take a look at the benchmark scores here now. I'm not going to go over all of these scores in detail because there are so many games and different resolutions and everything. But as I said, the big takeaway is 4K is definitely reality. With the 2080 Ti's, you can see every game averaging over 60 frames per second here, with the sole exception of Shadow of the Tomb Raider. That did come down just a hair below 60 frames per second, but it was still buttery smooth when I was actually playing in the game outside of the benchmark. It really was depending on the scene. There's just one scene in the benchmark that is really taxing on that. But for the most part, when you're in the jungles of the game, it's getting well over 60 FPS. And that's, all the games here running really well at 4K on the 2080 Ti, while the RTX 2080 is definitely still struggling with that. You're going to see the 4K 1% lows here. Also, of course, I did test 1440p. And 1080p, will go ahead and throw up the 1440p numbers right now. And you can see that the 2080, and I want to focus here on the 2080 and the 1080 Ti because these cards are so neck and neck. And that's why I said earlier that the RTX 2080 really seems like a glorified 1080 Ti, because it is. These cards are almost identical in terms of performance. The one outlier really was Wolfenstein 2 using the Vulkan API. Now, any of the games that had async compute on them, like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I don't think Shadow of the Tomb Raider did, but Sniper Elite 4, Strange Brigade, Wolfenstein 2, Gears of War 4, when games offered async compute, I used it in all of those games, but none of them really showed such a drastic difference between the 2080 and the 1080 Ti like Wolfenstein 2 did. So, I don't know, maybe that has a better implementation of async compute. And I was expecting to see this across all of the games with async compute because the 20 series is now using a hardware level solution for async compute rather than a software one. So I was expecting all of the games that had async compute to really leverage it as well as Wolfenstein 2 did on Vulkan, but that just really wasn't the case in the DX12 titles that I tested, like Sniper, Strange Brigade, and Gears of War 4. It just didn't leverage it the same way as Wolfenstein 2 did. So hopefully we'll see more of that going ahead in the future. I'll go ahead and put up the 1% lows now. You can see that, these cards are more than capable of doing 1440p, except in maybe some of the most extreme situations, like Assassin's Creed Origins is a brutally taxing game. So you're going to see some of these cards come down below 60 frames per second. And that game is also known notoriously to be very demanding on the CPU. And at 1080p, you're going to see a lot of scores that are pretty darn close to the 1440p numbers. And once again, that is really coming down to the CPU bottleneck that's being introduced at 1080p resolution, even on ultra settings. NVIDIA actually even sent out an email late Sunday night basically saying that, hey, you guys should be testing at 4K ultra settings and all of that, because on lower resolutions, you're going to be seeing a bottleneck. And that is definitely the case. And I have to assume that even if you were using an 8700K, having the extra cores and threads isn't really going to make up for this, because this processor was running at almost 5 gigahertz. And that's really going to be, the factor that's going to limit at the end of the day is clock speed more so than cores. I mean, there might be a couple of games here and there where that might not be the case, but for the most case, you're going to want clock speeds over cores in order to eliminate a bottleneck. And I did also want to do some temperature testing, so I did load up the Star Wars demo, which does actually, it runs on a loop if you put it up. I ran it in windowed mode so that I can keep an eye on the temps and everything in Precision X and MSI Afterburner. And after running for, it was about 50 minutes that I let this thing run while I went downstairs and had some lunch. And at the end of it, it was hovering around 80 degrees Celsius. But what is more important to note is that the clock speed of the GPU, I had the power limit increased all the way to the right, just like I did for the other benchmarks that I showed you, and it hovered around 80C, and the clock speed did not waver. It stayed right around the same exact clock speed throughout the entire thing, so there was no throttling happening there because of the temperatures on the GPU, but 80 degrees Celsius is still pretty darn toasty, and I could certainly feel that on the aluminum backplate when I would go to touch the card. It was getting seriously warm. So if you do want to tame these temperatures a bit more, you'll probably want to look at an aftermarket solution, but even though the temperatures are kind of on the high side on the Founders card, even though they're using dual fan heat sinks now, it's still getting quite warm, but it's not going to limit you. It's not going to throttle or anything like that. And overall, I really like the look and feel of the Founders Edition cards. They just are quality, like just feeling and looking wise, like they look amazing. And the fans were definitely quieter than the previous blower style cards, which were known for getting insanely loud. I did go ahead and run a sound test on the 2080 Ti during that benchmark run on the Star Wars ray tracing demo, so I'll go ahead and play that for you now. But that about wraps it up for all of our testing here on the RTX 2080 Ti and the RTX 2080 compared up against the 1080 and the 1080 Ti. I hope that, you can take away from this whether or not it's worth you upgrading. If you are running on a 1080 Ti right now and you're gaming at like 1440p, 144 hertz, there is honestly no reason for you to really go out and upgrade, especially not to the RTX 2080, because those cards are like pretty much the same exact card. Like they benchmark almost identically, except in the one case of Wolfenstein 2, the New Colossus. They're within like 4 to 5 frames of each other in most of the benchmarks, honestly. So I don't really know why the RTX 2080 is going to exist when those cards are selling for $800 to $900 right now, and you can go find 1080 Ti's for like $600 to $750. So they're cheaper right now by a significant margin. Like that's nothing to sneeze at. It's like $100 to $150 cheaper for the 1080 Ti's right now, but that's not going to last forever. Eventually, those cards will come to end of life. They will stop selling them, and then the prices will go up. So if you were looking to upgrade, maybe you're coming from the 9 series or something even older than that, if you were looking at the 2080, I would say to go try to find a more affordable 1080 Ti out there, because I think it's gonna basically perform almost identical to what the 2080 can do. However, the 2080 Ti, that is definitely an impressive card, but it's $1,200. It's a serious price premium, and I don't think that card's going to be worth it for most people unless you're wanting to game at 4K or you just want to get in on the ground in terms of ray tracing, but that's going to be limited in how many games that support it, and then it's still going to be taxing as hell, even at 1080p, when we do start to see games rolling out with it. But it's definitely an impressive card. It's the most powerful card in the world right now. You cannot compete with it. There's no question about it. So if you need the most powerful card, then the 2080 Ti is going to be it. It's pretty much the new Titan. I'm going to be using it for ultra-wide gaming here on a new system in the very near future, and I certainly look forward to taking advantage of it for ultra-wide. But I think even just for regular 1440p, it's going to be overkill in a lot of instances. Maybe we'll see some more games come out in the future that are going to be more taxing and actually, leverage the card. And I'm not even talking about with ray tracing. Hopefully we'll see some more taxing games in the future that can leverage it. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think the 2080 Ti is going to be perfect for people that want to use it for 4K. The 2080 doesn't. I don't know why it exists. Get a 1080 Ti instead. And that's really all we have going right now. We haven't seen the 2070 yet, but if I were a betting man, I would say that it's probably going to perform comparably to the GTX 1080, which I tested here. So, in both of those situations, you could probably save yourself some money by buying the older generation card. But I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here, guys. Please let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. As always, if you enjoyed this video or learned something new, don't forget to leave a thumbs up on it and subscribe if you're not already, and ring that notification bell. That way you never miss a moment of any of the RTX content that I'm going to be doing throughout the coming weeks. ultra-wide benchmarks. If there's any other thing you want to see me test, let me know down in the comments below. I definitely want to do a follow-up with Ryzen testing as well and try these cards out with Ryzen and see if, you know, that does anything differently compared to an Intel-based system. So we're going to definitely get to all of that. This is just the initial review, and there will be tons more content coming around RTX in the very near future, so stay tuned for that. I love you guys very much, and I will see you tomorrow for another video. Ta-ra.